commission reported its findings in 2004. It's kind of now seen as the official report on what happened in 9/11.
The 9/11 Commission report runs to over 500 pages. It basically concluded that the 9/11 attacks were carried out by al-Qaeda terrorists who exploited gaps in U.S. intelligence, especially a lack of coordination between agencies like the CIA and the FBI. On the issue of foreign funding, however, the Commission found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials funded al-Qaeda. And Omar al-Bayoumi himself is mentioned. The report said there was no credible evidence he knowingly aided extremist groups. But not everyone agreed.
Some people weren't happy that the report was thorough enough. And so within the FBI, you obviously had San Diego field officers who would have been investigating the Pentagon hijackers Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, and they weren't satisfied with the 9/11 Commission's report. They thought there was more to this Saudi connection.
And that division of the FBI in San Diego was looking into this because the two hijackers you mentioned were living in San Diego before the attack, before 9/11.
That's right. Because they were the first two hijackers to even enter the USA via California, there was a long time to look at what they'd been doing.
It was San Diego investigators going door to door in the days after 9/11 who had first identified al-Bayoumi. His old neighbor said the hijackers were often hanging out with him.
San Diego FBI field officers were quite concerned when they saw the 9/11 Commission report because it ostensibly gave al-Bayoumi, a clean bill of health. And they thought there was more there. And so they continued their own kind of offshoot, which they called Operation Encore. So Operation Encore really sort of zeroed down on this Saudi support network and what part did al-Bayoumi play. And so they were very keen to find out, well, how did Omar al-Bayoumi meet these two hijackers and end up being a guarantor and opening bank accounts for them? And they managed to get hold of a young man called Kaysen Morgan. Now, he was just 22, was quite a recent convert to Islam. And he told Operation Encore officers that he had accompanied Omar al-Bayoumi to that trip to the consulate in LA to renew the passport.
Remember, al-Bayoumi told British police he drove to LA with a young Muslim convert.
I went to Los Angeles with Osama, American guy. Okay, he's Muslim also.
They stopped for a bite to eat before heading home. And when he suddenly heard some young men at the next table speaking his dialect, he decided to introduce himself.
They said, we have been here for about 24 days and we want to go to English school and we don't know how to go there.
He gave them his phone number and said, why don't you come to San Diego? Which Nawaf and Khalid, two of the Pentagon hijackers, did a few days later.
Now, Kaysen gives a different version. He says that he and Omar al-Bayoumi went and sat in the restaurant first, that it seemed like that al-Bayoumi had deliberately picked a seat near the window, and that the two hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, came in later, and that it seemed like, Kaysen said that it seemed like Omar al-Bayoumi was looking out for them, that he was looking through the window and kind of almost expecting them. He then says that Khalid and Nawaf sat some distance away from their table to the point that it would have been impossible to pick up any speech and recognize their accent, as al-Bayoumi had said to the detectives. Kaysen then goes on to say that al-Bayoumi deliberately went over to the table where Mihdhar and Hazmi were sat, and that all three of them were speaking for about 30 minutes in Arabic. And because Kaysen doesn't understand Arabic, he says he doesn't know what they were talking about. But he certainly doesn't give this meeting the flavor of it being accidental.
And then, in 2012, 5 years after Operation Encore began, officers in San Diego got a phone call which would break open their investigation.
It was Operation Encore who received the phone call from the evidence technician who we spoke about earlier in Washington, who had come across this crate of evidence marked Omar al-Bayoumi. Luckily, the technician realized, well, this will be of interest to the San Diego field officers, and directly called them.
So what did they find when this crate of documents, of materials, were eventually given to Operation Encore from the evidence technician?
So the most astounding piece of evidence they found was a small notebook made in America by a company called Topps. And in this notepad, I think it was something like 5 inches by 8 inches, lined notepad, yellow paper, was a hand-drawn diagram.
And what did this diagram look like?
So I've actually got a copy of the diagram here.
Oh, wow. So this is it. So
this is it, yeah.
Oh, this is a photo of
This is the
notepad.
photo taken by the West Midlands Police. As soon as they found it, they took a picture of it, and you can see it's opened up on a kind of yellow page lined notepad, as I said, about 5 by 8 inches. And you're seeing this notepad that's been opened up on the relevant page, and you see there written in blue ink, starts off with what looks like some kind of equation. D equals this, and then there's the kind of
radical H, that's
equation mark.
H plus, it's not a particularly mathematically advanced equation if you have any maths background.
Yeah, it seems like doodling almost, like scribbles. But again, they are very exact numbers.
Yeah.
There's not much crossing out. Whoever's written this seems to be quite sure of these details. But again, written not in a very technical way, shall we say. There's a crude picture of an aeroplane.
Right, this tiny little picture.
Yeah, tiny little plane, which is clearly an airplane.
And there's a dotted line and an H underneath.
Yeah.
So I guess H is height.
Yeah, it actually explains that the H means height. So he's actually put
it actually says equals height.
Yeah. And the other
height,
thing was
the
distance.
plane from the Earth in miles.
That's right. Yeah, so it's very particular. So it's basically showing some kind of line of sight of the aeroplane with, as I said, these lines that seem to show a downward trajectory, shall we say.
And then D, distance from, it says this, like it actually says in words.
You spelt it out in English.
Spelt it out in English. Distance from the plane to horizon.
Yeah.
Huh. And then there's a bunch of numbers as well, and another equation, 2,500 equals H squared plus 8,000 H.
And it obviously involves aviation and distance and lines of sight.
At the bottom of the notebook page is a seemingly random list of numbers. 44, 25, 80, 76. But when the numbers were analyzed, a pattern emerged.
They actually coincide with the kind of coordinates of what's known as way stations on the eastern seaboard of America. Now that sounds very complicated, but it's essentially if a pilot doesn't have any electronic aids and wants to land, you have these kind of navigational aids called waypoints, and they're dotted around America, and their positions are public. You can find out where these beacons, almost, you could say, are situated.
And these way stations on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. are so important because of what we've learned since about the planning of the 9/11 attacks.
Al-Qaeda released a video a year after 9/11 where Al-Qaeda first admitted that they carried it out. The video came out actually on the anniversary of 9/11 in 2002. And it was quite a lengthy video in which bin Laden finally admits, we did this operation. There is also other footage of the hijackers sort of training in Afghanistan in preparation for 9/11. And at one point you see a map in the background. You see the hijackers or some of the hijackers, and in the background is a map which is pointing out the way stations on the eastern seaboard of America, which tally with this diagram.
And this diagram, the police detectives, the British police detectives interrogating al-Bayoumi, they hadn't seen this when they arrested him?
No, they were never told about the existence of this plane diagram at all throughout that week of interrogating, even though we know for a fact that this diagram was found by the police during the search within 24 hours, certainly by the 22nd of September. It had been bagged. Not only had it been bagged, a note had been put on there that this is a diagram that seems to show some kind of plane equations, and it was marked category 1, which basically means this is urgent. You need to look at this soon.
And it was handed to the FBI, and then it was not handed to the police detectives.
Again, because of international protocol, the British officers didn't have the authority to analyse it themselves. And especially if anything had American written on it, as I said, the fact that this notebook was made in the USA by a company called Topps meant the British had to hand it over immediately to the FBI, and the FBI choose whether to pass that on to the interviewing officers who are sat in the room with al-Bayoumi. And in this instance, they chose not to share this with those interviewing officers.
We can sit here today and look at this drawing made by al-Bayoumi, hold a printout of this sketch of a plane and equations in our hands, because it was declassified by President Biden in 2021. It was part of a move to declassify loads of evidence related to 9/11 investigations. And it was only then that DC David Campbell, who had interrogated al-Bayoumi for 7 days before being forced to let him go, saw it for the first time on YouTube.
He told me that he was absolutely stunned when he saw it. He was very angry and frustrated that he hadn't been given this, considering it was in the house. He was interviewing Bayoumi. And his first thought really was how bad for the families that this hadn't come out, and that he felt almost that he hadn't been able to do his job as an interrogator properly.
So, Amardeep, at the end of all of this, what does Operation Encore finally conclude? And particularly, what do they conclude about al-Bayoumi?
Well, Encore certainly threw up more questions. They felt that the Commission report's findings that al-Bayoumi was an innocent weren't quite correct and warranted further investigation. And the result was that they felt Bayoumi had a lot more questions to answer.
And there was one woman who was going to get those answers.
It's hard to put into words what betrayal feels like. I mean, that's what it is. It's a betrayal. He should have been extradited to the United States. He should have been held responsible.
Amardeep, you mentioned that Operation Encore, this special investigation within the FBI, that was set up because they weren't satisfied with the findings of the 9/11 Commission. They concluded that Omar al-Bayoumi had more to answer for. And the reason that we're finally getting answers today is basically down to kind of a battle being waged by some of the victims' families who weren't satisfied with the official version of events of what happened on 9/11. We actually heard from the woman kind of leading the charge, Terry Strada, in episode 1. Her husband, Tom, died in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He was working at the World Trade Center that morning. Can you just remind us, how did you come to be in touch with her?
So again, Terry was somebody that my partner, Liz, who worked on this story with me, managed to track down. She'd been very vocal, Terry, as regards to wanting answers and not really accepting the official version that had come out.
September 11th brought a lot more horrors than just, somebody's died and you're going to bury them, and you're going to have a funeral, and you're going to possibly, move on from that point. There was no recovery of Tom. Nothing. And because you don't have recovery, it makes it a little bit more difficult and challenging to really get your children to understand that he is gone and that he's not coming back. So the first couple of months, definitely past Christmas, that constant having to reassure my children that their father was dead was really horrific. And now I would say there's a lot of anger building because of the damage I can see that's happened to my children and that they're having to live through this.
As the days and weeks after Tom's death unfolded and Terry's grief and anger built, she finally managed to connect with some other women who were going through the same thing. And they suggested that there might be something Terry could do about her overwhelming anger and confusion.
So I was in a support group that was wonderful with other widows. And one day somebody said there was going to be an attorney in South Jersey that was going to talk about, a lawsuit that we could possibly join. And there weren't any details about it. I didn't know very much at all.
One day in November, 2 months after losing her husband, Terry went down to a law firm in New Jersey where she met a man named Ron Motley.
Not a very tall man in stature, but a huge man in personality, and he was charismatic, and he reminded me of Tom right away. The first thing out of his mouth was, your government is lying to you. They're lying to you that there was no state sponsors of September 11th.
While the U.S. administration focused on invading Afghanistan and killing bin Laden, Motley's firm was proposing a lawsuit to hunt down and hold accountable anyone who provided material support to al-Qaeda, including banks, charities, individuals, and crucially, the country that was the source of 15 of the 19 hijackers, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
And he said it was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that was responsible for financing al-Qaeda. We didn't know everything. I didn't know. I was going to learn what I've learned over the past 20 years. But if we didn't have the lawsuit, which would allow us discovery, we were never going to know the full truth. So I signed on right away and became an advocate for the families, because within the first year, less than a year, we went to D.C. and we stood on a stage and we announced to the world we were suing the Saudis and we were going to bankrupt terrorism.
By August 2002, they had formed a steering committee, the 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism, and filed a $1 trillion lawsuit against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Painstakingly, over the next 2 decades, the families and their lawyers went looking for evidence to build their case, including all the material seized from Omar al-Bayoumi's 3 properties in Birmingham. Not even Operation Encore had managed to get their hands on every piece of this evidence from FBI Central Command. So the families decided to take a different approach.
So in the end, the plaintiff's lawyers realized, well, maybe the Metropolitan Police have got copies. In fact, they knew they had copies of the evidence because the original evidence was returned to al-Bayoumi when he was released. But the MPS, Metropolitan Police Service, had kept a copy, one for themselves and one for the FBI. And so the plaintiff's lawyers sought to go after getting those copies, which meant they had to come to the UK, had to get a High Court order compelling the Metropolitan Police to hand them over. And the Metropolitan Police did not fight back and very diligently handed over the last 2 years in various tranches all the evidence that was seized.
Wow. And what do they find?
So what was found at al-Bayoumi's residences, and there were, as I said, there were 3 addresses that were raided. The 2 houses that he'd been living in Birmingham, and also his office at Aston University. Most of the evidence was found at Dymoke Street, which he had only recently moved into. And I'm talking boxes of evidence, some found in the garage, some found in the house. But essentially he had documented everything he had done for the last 3 or 4 years. Wow. And what I mean by documented is almost in a report kind of way. I did this, I've done that. Lots of personal letters that are sent to some of the highest ranking Saudi officials in Riyadh. Wow. Members of something called the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. It's clear he's got links to these religious officials as well as diplomats, Saudi diplomats inside America, also back in Saudi Arabia. So lots of documents. Also found was a handwritten contacts book, 150 pages long, all written in hand, mainly by al-Bayoumi. What was very telling was that in the contact book was a code name for one of the hijackers. Now, when I say code name, it's something called a kunya. And a kunya is basically the code name that al-Qaeda would give its operatives. And these code names are highly secretive. Only the top tier of planners would know the code names. And in fact, all the 19 hijackers had code names or kunyas, but these kunyas weren't made public until that video that al-Qaeda put out on the anniversary of 9/11 to say we did it. That was the first time that Osama bin Laden, one by one, tells the viewers these are the kunyas and why we chose them. In Bayoumi's address book was the kunya for one of the hijackers. Now, only somebody on the top level would know that kunya. So that was very telling. What are you doing with the secret code name in your book? Another crucial thing they found was the 80 videotapes.
Oh, right, the 80 videotapes that were wheeled into the interrogation room when al-Bayoumi was being interviewed by the British police.
That's right, it was a bag of tapes and it was labelled as exhibit number PSS/100. And in there were a number of videotapes, including the welcoming party video with the two hijackers, which we've already spoken about.
Right.
But there was also another video that was marked Washington Trip, June 1999. So again, that would have piqued the interest of any investigator. He's videoing a Washington trip. Washington was going to be possibly one of the targets.
Yeah.
Capitol Hill. On the face of it, it might look like a tourist video, but then parts of it get quite un-tourist-like, shall we say.
Al-Bayoumi points the camera to a tower in the distance. He says, "This tower, whose name I haven't discovered yet. I will get over there, and I will report. I will report to you in detail what is there." Also, the airport is not far away. Here's the airplane taking off from there. In front of the Congress. There is no power nor strength except through Allah.
He also makes reference to a plan.
Their cars. You said that in the plan.
And he talks about my esteemed brothers. So whoever he's sending this video to or narrating it to is somebody quite senior. And he's panning towards where security guards are.
One of the side gates. Here are some security officers walking around the most important building. Here, we welcome you from the Capitol Hill, the American Congress.
It is, what has been described in court by the plaintiff's experts as a classic hostile reconnaissance video, what we might say in layman's terms as a casing video. And bear in mind, the timing of this video, June 1999, was only 2 months after we know that al-Qaeda had picked their targets for 9/11, and one of the targets was going to be Capitol Hill.
This was the video, left at the bottom of the bags of tapes, which were wheeled out of the interrogation room, unwatched.
The interrogating officers didn't know about it. 9/11 Commission didn't know about it. It wasn't shared by the FBI to even their own field officers.
Omar al-Bayoumi has still to this day never been questioned about the Washington, D.C. video. But in June 2021, as part of the lawsuit brought by the families, al-Bayoumi did have to give an interview to their lawyers, what's known as a deposition in the States. There, he was asked about the plane diagram for the first time, but he claimed it was just doodling. When asked about the equations in the notebook, he said, quote, "It's just an equation, like any other equation." Omar al-Bayoumi has always denied any involvement in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, instead insisting he was a civil servant studying in the U.S. who met the 9/11 hijackers by coincidence. Why was so much information kept from the 9/11 Commission and from the British police detectives interrogating al-Bayoumi?
We can only speculate. Even the plaintiff's lawyers haven't actually used the word this was deliberately buried and hidden by the FBI. But, as sensible people, you would have thought something certainly like the plane diagram and the Washington video would set alarm bells very early and would point to, who's behind this. So, yeah, we can only speculate, but the fact remains that within 24 hours, the Americans knew that there's a very strong Saudi connection here, but didn't follow it up.
We reached out to the FBI for the story, but they did not want to comment. Amardeep, bring us up to the present day. We've had years of evidence kind of slowly being uncovered and being made public.
Yeah.
What is happening now, like today?
So right now we're at a very critical juncture in the whole lawsuit. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had put forward a motion to dismiss the case in its entirety, and that was heard for more than a year. Evidence was presented by the families to suggest that Saudi Arabia was involved, and the judge had been listening to all of this. A couple of weeks ago, Judge George Daniels, who's hearing the case in Manhattan, came back with a momentous decision. He basically denied Saudi Arabia's motion to dismiss the entire case and ruled in favour of the families, basically paving the way for a full civil trial and for further evidence to be presented to the court. In his decision, the judge said, and I quote, "The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia did not proffer sufficient evidence to the contrary. Although the kingdom attempts to offer seemingly innocent explanations or context, they are either self-contradictory or not strong enough to overcome the inference that the kingdom had employed Bayoumi and another Saudi official to assist the hijackers."
Wow. So the families of the victims of 9/11, they're allowed to proceed in their lawsuit against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So what does the lawsuit actually allege?
Well, according to Gavin Simpson, one of the lawyers for the 9/11 families, he told the court in the US, and I'm going to read this from the court filing.
Yeah.
He said, "The evidence is clear that Saudi Arabia deployed its officials and agents to serve in an illegal government enterprise that was extensively intertwined with terrorism, so that the agents were acting within their core mission when they helped integrate the hijackers into the United States." Close quotes. Now, Saudi Arabia has consistently and vehemently denied all the accusations.
We approached the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for comment on this story, but they did not respond.
We expect a lot of more evidence to come over the next few months. The case that has been going on over the last 20 years has been very restricted in its remit, and this really opens up the whole case, really, so that any evidence that the plaintiffs may have had and weren't able to present in earlier proceedings, it means they can really open up all that evidence now and present evidence which previously was inadmissible.
And Amardeep, your story came out in the Sunday Times paper last week, and the very next day, it was mentioned in Parliament. How did that feel?
It felt very satisfying.
Yesterday's Sunday Times revealed that in the aftermath of 9/11, the Metropolitan Police were forced to release Omar al-Bayoumi, believed to be a Saudi intelligence agent accused of supporting the hijackers, because the FBI withheld evidence.
It's not every day that your stories end up being talked about on the floor of the House of Commons.
The UK police and FBI had clear evidence that Omar al-Bayoumi assisted terrorists and had close links to...
But it was good to see that there was multi-party support for answers.
Yesterday's Sunday Times. And I accept that it raises a number of important questions that are absolutely worthy of scrutiny and are deserving of the attention of this House.
There was a call made for the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee to launch an investigation.
Intelligence Presidency, that's its Secret Service. Madam Deputy Speaker, a full investigation by the Intelligence and Security Committee is needed, investigating why the FBI clearly avoided extraditing Mr. al-Bayoumi, and also exactly what the involvement of the Saudi government was.
Which now seems very likely, to find out exactly what happened in that week.
And Terry Strada, who, as we've said, is part of this group of victims' family members pushing for the lawsuit, how does she feel about what's happening right now?
Certainly she feels a lot of relief.
When the announcement came a couple weeks ago that Judge Daniels denied Saudi Arabia's motion to dismiss the case, paving the way for a full trial, Terry was at home making dinner.
The phone rang, and it was another 9/11 widow. And she just said, "Congratulations." And I said, "What happened?" She said, "You don't know." And I said, "I don't, but I know what you're going to tell me." I was elated and a huge feeling of relief that the decision, not only that it finally came in because it's been over a year, but that the judge said there's enough evidence. You can move forward with the case. That was just music to my ears. That is something we've been fighting for over 2 decades. For us, for American victims of terrorism, it's a huge victory. This is a strong deterrent for any nation that may be funding terrorist organizations to, that they can be held accountable in a U.S. court. That's the victory here, that you can be held accountable in a U.S. court if you fund a designated terrorist organization that harms or murders Americans on U.S. soil.
If the families are ultimately successful, it would be the first time the Saudi state has been held responsible for 9/11. And with a $1 trillion price tag, it could be the largest civil lawsuit in history. It would also forever change our understanding of the world's worst terror attack.
It totally changes the whole premise of what happened after 9/11. The whole, was the whole war on terror based on a mistake? I mean, again, we can say with some authority now that certainly, the Saudi connection would have appeared within days of 9/11. Yet, America chose instead to wage a war of terror on Afghanistan, on Iraq. And Saudi Arabia wasn't touched in any shape or form when, if there is any hard evidence that goes over years, then that was the place they should have started.
This series was written and produced by me, Taryn Siegel. You can read Amardeep Bassey and Liz Harris's full investigation at thetimes.com with a subscription. The executive producers were Dan Box and Kate Lamble. Sound design was by Tiffany Dimmack, with our theme tune by Mal Lassetto. If you have thoughts on this series, we really want to hear them. You can leave a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or send us an email at thestory@thetimes.com.